You didn't mention Lebanon. Strikes me that that's potentially a flashpoint to bring a lot of these influences you were talking about together into a state of actually open conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
I did not mention Lebanon because I see Lebanon basically on hold until things sort themselves out in Syria. Should there be a regime change in Syria, then the Hezbollah, which is so powerful in Lebanon, will lose much of its power. Should the regime survive and be fit, then it will continue and perhaps increase its power. So the real important dynamics in Libya depend on developments in Syria.
Down the front here, Alex. You want to speak up a bit?
Could you make this higher?
No, that's the best we can do. Okay. Well, we can turn it up, but off you go. Yeah.
Do you see the recent regime change in Egypt as possessing implications for shipping through the Suez Canal?
The major development in terms of Suez Canal was the passage some months ago of 2 Iranian warships through it. I don't know if there are other changes besides that. I think there has been an increased attention to Egyptian public opinion in the last few months. Not a profound change again, but an increased attention. Whether it be the liberals, to whom Tantawi has thrown the sop of having a Mubarak in a gurney put into an iron cage and humiliated, or whether it be for the Islamists to allow to improve relations with Iran, or I'm not quite sure what happened in Sinai recently, but to take a more aggressive stance vis-a-vis Israel. Again, I don't see these as fundamental shifts. I don't think they hearken a deep rethinking of Egyptian policies.
Yeah, down the front, Jeff. Are you up the back, you want? Okay.
In over the last year or so, or perhaps even longer, there seems to have been some unrest in Iran, some popular indication there might be some unrest. What's the chances of some sort of change of regime in Iran?
What about Iran? The important development in Iran is that the Iranian people have been subject to the predations of radical Islam since 1979, since Khomeini came to power, and rapidly turned away from it. I draw the comparison between Iran today and the Soviet Union in the time of Brezhnev in the 1970s. A powerful and bellicose state, but a hollow state, and that very few of the subjects of that state are willing to accept its ideology and its institutions and its goals. And therefore a very fragile state, brittle state. I think that is the case in Iran. The most dramatic manifestation of that hostility towards the state came in June of 2009 in the aftermath of fraudulent elections for the presidency. And they went on for some months. And there were very large demonstrations in quite a few cities, which were eventually suppressed through force by the regime. That stifled the anti-regime sentiment. It did not destroy it. Those sentiments are there, and if anything, are growing. I think it's entirely possible that there could be some conflagration, some small incident that gets out of hand, as it did in so many, for example, in so many other countries, for example, in Syria. Something small leads to something big. I think that's entirely possible in Iran. I see Iran as the one place in the entire globe where Islamism is in decline. I see it, again, somewhat in a parallel way to the Soviet Union, as the font of anti-Islamist ideas. It's the single most important Muslim country. Turkey's probably second, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia would follow. But Iran led the Muslim world into Islamism, and I expect and hope that it will lead it out of Islamism. And so it's a bit ironic that the Turkey of Ataturk has become Islamist and popular so, whereas the Iran of Khomeini has abandoned Islamism and wants something else. It's the one country in the Muslim world where there's a real interest and attraction to the West, where our radio and television stations and our music and our fashions, again, it's comparable to the Soviet bloc, are attractive. The rest of the Muslim world are not. So I have high hopes for Iran, and I do hope that conflagration will take place, both on strategic grounds, to avoid the kind of problems that might follow with the building of nuclear weapons, the terrorism and so forth, and also on ideological grounds, and that this is the key country for Islamism.
Down the back there. Yeah. And you're like,
Just coming back to Egypt, do you envisage somebody tapping in the shoulders of Mohammed al-Baradei to form a government at all, and how would the other countries in the region react?
Well, polls show that the most likely president would be Amr Moussa, the former foreign minister of Egypt and then the head of the Arab League, who is a Nasserite, not an Islamist, as I think really Baradei is as well, as a Nasserite, but he has made accommodations to the Islamists. Again, I don't think it's terribly important. This will be a non-military man who serves under the aegis of a military dictatorship, and it will be Tantawi or the next military leader who will be the ultimate arbiter of Egypt's destiny. And that's not to say the president will be a puppet or have no power at all, but it'll be secondary. Like the prime, what we have basically is a change of titles. Until recently, it was the president who was the military figure, and it was the prime minister who was the non-military figure. How many Egyptian prime ministers' names can you remember? They were not very significant. Well, basically, we'll see the head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces now be the key figure, and the president will be, in effect, what the prime minister was before. Not an insignificant figure, but not one making the key decisions of state, and certainly not the one delineating the foreign policy, and not the decisions of war and peace.
If things do get become further unstable in Syria, do you expect that Iran would be drawn into the conflict? And if that were to occur, would NATO be drawn in turn as a result of that?
Well, Iran already is in the conflict. There are strong indications that there is Iranian money, Iranian arms, Iranian trainers, and possibly even Iranian soldiers repressing the population. And this brings up a couple of interesting points. First, the Iranians and the Syrians both cultivated a connection to Syria. But when the troubles began earlier this year, the Iranians doubled their bet and are helping the regime, whereas the Turks, being more sophisticated, said to Bashar al-Assad, you need to change your ways. They haven't listened to the Turks, and there's tension between Ankara and Damascus. And I believe that's also significant in showing tension between Ankara and Tehran, that while they've been working together quite nicely in recent years, they are natural rivals, they're historic rivals, and they have different versions of Islamism that are not going to be compatible. And the Syrian example is the first we have had of their incompatibility. So the Iranians are already involved. I have a hard time imagining NATO joining in. One, because there was fatigue at the Libyan, and not to speak of Afghan and Iraqi expeditionary forces. Secondly, there is nobody to support at this point. There's no Benghazi. There's no independent rebel area. The Syrian opposition forces are out on the street and then go home. They don't have an area of their own. So how exactly would NATO come in? Thirdly, the the repercussions of the Assad dynasty's fall could be far more problematic than in Libya. In Libya, there are tribes, there are ideological differences, but Libya is basically one ethnicity. There are Berbers, but basically one ethnicity of Sunni Muslims who speak Arabic. In Syria, it's a milder version of what exists in Lebanon. It's a country full of minorities. Kurdish speakers, Alawis, the dominant element the last 40 years, are a religion that came out of Islam, and they're about an eighth of the population. Various different Christians, Druze, Circassians, and there's a real likelihood, a real possibility, I should say, that the collapse of the Assad regime would lead to internecine fighting such as one has seen in Iraq. And I think NATO would be leery of getting involved in that. So for these various reasons, I doubt there will be intervention, at least as things now look.
Back there, we've got about three now. So
Thanks for your presentation, Doctor. Just one more thing before we go forward. Maybe one of the reasons for overthrowing their own governments in the Arab world or the Middle East was a highly unpopular, to say it mildly, support of the present governments of the US and the Western world around there. Where does it leave the US at this point of time and the Western world? And secondly, what is exactly happening in Bahrain where the US Fifth Fleet is now situated?
Your first question is saying that good relations with the West have been a reason for the uprisings.
One of the reasons.
One of the reasons. Good relations is I think an exaggeration. There are working relations between, say, all of the Arabic-speaking states except Syria and the United States and the West more broadly. They're not particularly good. We don't share common values. We don't share anything of significance. These are tactical alignments that are useful for them and for us. So there's not much there. There's a working relationship. I mean, to take Egypt as an example, U.S. government has, and take Egypt and the U.S. government as exemplars of this. A solid working relationship since almost 40 years ago when Sadat threw out the Russians. Substantial flow of money from the United States to Egypt. A very large embassy in Cairo. Military relations are quite deep, and so forth. But on issue after issue, the two governments disagree. There are considerable tensions, considerable irritation, discussion all the time about ending this military, about ending the financial commitments. These are not friendly. These are not really friendly relations. They're working relations. So I just disagree on the premise somewhat. Yes, no doubt that good relations with the West are something that hotheads can use, but it's striking to see that so far in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and to a lesser extent other countries, that has not been a theme. More broadly, these have been domestically oriented rebellions, talking about responsibility and freedom and democracy and economic opportunity, and it's been striking to see how they have not been conspiratorial, they have not been anti-Western, not been anti-Zionist. There are elements here and there, to be sure, but that's not the main thrust. And that has been a very welcome sign. Indeed, that's the most positive thing about 2011, is that one sees a maturation of politics in Arabic-speaking countries, that they are taking responsibility for themselves. And one very nice illustration of that was in Tahrir Square, which is a giant square. The usually slovenly Egyptians just throw things on the ground, cleaning up after themselves, having teams go and clean up the refuse, showing, they take responsibility. They're not going to just leave it to the state, leave it to someone else. And it was very impressive to see that. Now, they're not anywhere near the corridors of power. They're not going to be taking over, but they are. It is heartwarming to learn that such people exist and exist in numbers and make a difference. So no, I don't think that anti-Western sentiments are at the heart of this. I think it's far more positive, and much more about growing and becoming part of the modern world. And there's a second part about Bahrain. As I indicated before, Iran is the head of the resistance bloc of states, and what I didn't mention, but Saudi Arabia is the head of the status quo bloc of states, which are numerous: Morocco and Algeria, and Jordan, and many of the states that now have had trouble. Where the goal is not to unsettle things, but the goal is to enjoy life. As I was talking about before, the Egyptian military, they have a vast economic enterprise. They're well off. They enjoy life. I don't know, the rulers in Tunisia, in Libya, invited Mariah Carey to come to a birthday party and gave her $1 million for it. In Tunisia, they kept pet lions in the palaces, and so good life. Lots of cars and planes and so forth. That's what it's about. It's not about ideas or visions. And the Iranian versus the Saudi blocs is an important division in the Middle East. It's complementary to the Arab-Israeli division. And there've been fights. For example, in Yemen, the Houthi war has been a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And likewise, the Bahrain situation a few months ago was a proxy, not quite war, but proxy confrontation between Iranian and Saudi sides. And the Saudis simply repressed it with success. Not necessarily for always, but for now with success. And the U.S. government, who, as you point out, has its Fifth Fleet anchored in Bahrain, rather uncomfortably sat by as this took place, but didn't say anything. These are the compromises that states make. And I think, while I can't exactly condone it, I think insisting on a consistent policy towards every one of these states is asking too much. One has to be flexible and allow for certain inconsistencies.
You mentioned in answering that question, I think you used the phrase participating in the modern world as something that unites a lot of the people in the uprising. And I guess one of the themes we've seen is the use of technology to communicate amongst themselves and also with the outside world. And presumably that technology provides a lot of input into some of those ideas that seems to be driving these people there. Would you like to say a few words about the role of technology in terms of its threat to the Islamists, and whether this might even be a weapon that the West could use to take things further?
Certainly the technology had an important role. For example, in Tunisia, everything got started on the 17th of December when a fruit and produce vendor was slapped by a female policewoman who just humiliated him, and he couldn't get any justice at the town hall, so he self-immolated and died a couple of weeks later. And this, which would have been an obscure act in prior decades, acquired an importance in Tunisia and then internationally as a result of the social media. And one can see, likewise, in Egypt and elsewhere, that being able to communicate via the phones, in particular computers less, has been very important. I don't think this is something that will hurt the Islamists. The Islamists tend to be very up-to-date. In fact, if you go on the internet and look up Islam, you will probably bump into an Islamist site. They are active and effective on the internet and in other ways. It is traditional Islam, non-Islamist Islam, that has been passed by. The ulama, the traditional figures, the imams in the mosques, they don't know anything about the internet. But the Islamists tend to be, in fact, technology-minded young people, or not even so young. I mean, over and over again you see the leaders of the Islamist parties being engineers, not being educated, not being memorizers of the Quran at the age of 12, but being technology students at the university who find Islam in their 20s. They're not profoundly grounded in the religion. They come to it later in life and are to some extent autodidacts, and they're eager to marry their technological knowledge with their religion. And so the Islamists are prospering. I think the internet, social media have been quite beneficial for the Islamists versus other kinds of Muslims.
And then when you finish, could you just pass about 3 along, please? And then you're after that. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Do you feel that the Western leaders are reasonably well versed in extreme Islamist ways, or are you still trying to educate them?
Still trying to educate them. The easy part are the bin Ladens. Right, we can all agree he's an enemy. No debate there. In general, violent Islamists are clearly the enemy. Where things get to, and likewise, Muslims who are patriotic and modern are clearly on our side. The middle ground is the problematic area. The Islamists who are wearing modern clothes, articulate in Western languages, using the political system, the educational system, the media, and the like. The Turkish example is the Islamism 2.0, as I called it, is the problem. Whether it be in Turkey or whether it be here, the Islamists have generally avoided using violence. Few of them engage in terrorism. It's not an effective way to go. You engage in terrorism, what do you achieve? I mean, if you look back, what did Bali achieve? What did 9/11 achieve? What did Beslan achieve? What did Madrid achieve? What did London achieve? What did Bombay achieve? None of them, I think, can be seen to actually have forwarded the Islamist movement. Instead, working through the schools, the media, the law courts, the political process is getting them ahead. And here the best example would be Turkey for the majority Muslim countries and UK for the West, where you're seeing in Britain now, almost on a daily basis, some adjustment to Sharia, to Islamic law. And that part is proving to be extremely difficult to educate not just politicians, but TV producers and newspaper editors and deans at universities and principals. I mean, you find the Islamists are going out and doing sensitivity trainings at police headquarters and kindergartens and elderly groups and whatnot. They're making great strides, and it's very hard to convince people that this is part of the problem. That never mind the fact they're not using violence, their political goals are deeply antithetical to what we believe in. There's a focus on the fact that they are not using violence, and that makes them okay. If they use violence, they're the problem. If they don't use violence, they're part of the solution. Couldn't disagree more. It's proving extremely difficult to get that point across.
Okay, lady just and then the gentleman in front of her, and then to you.
Could you elaborate on the Republican Party's policy towards the Middle East and the main differences between that and Obama's party? Thank you.
The American divide, liberal conservative, is roughly the same as you have, I think. And generally everywhere, that conservatives are focused on Israel and defending Israel and building relations with Israel, and are worried about Iran, more roughly what I've been saying. And on the left, one finds coolness, verging on hostility towards Israel, less concern about Iran, more willingness on the Islam question. Conservatives have the point of view that I just espoused, and on the left, one finds more willingness to deal with the Islamists. In general, what's so striking is that one sees continuity between communism and Islamism on the part of us. And this came home to me a while ago, 1994. I was on a panel, and the moderator of all people was George McGovern, who ran for president on the far left of the Democratic Party in 1972. And he and I disagreed, though he was running for president. He didn't know who I was, but he and I disagreed on the Soviet Union back then. I was much more worried about the Soviet Union than he was. And likewise, moving up a couple decades, I was much more concerned about the Islamists than he was. I think it's a temperament, and it's found everywhere roughly the same. So the Republicans see Israel at the center and are concerned about Islamism, concerned about Iran. Democrats are not seeing Israel at the center in the same way and are much less concerned about these other issues.
My question, I'll preface first of all with a statement, please correct me if I'm wrong. It relates to the United Nations and the way the United Nations member states are committed to change their internal laws to suit the agenda of their United Nations commitments. This can range from anything to local speed rules, civilian disarmament, UNHCR issues, and there are a vast range of issues. When Australia, for example, commits to the United Nations and via the UNHCR and its humanitarian objectives, isn't the UN condoning the spread of a risky, what do you call it? Well, it's not so much a religion, but a way of life, I suppose, Islam, which has got Islamism in it. Doesn't the UN bear a degree of responsibility for allowing for condoning the spread of Islam through into other nations, and hence we are having the problems?
Perhaps the best example of what you're citing are efforts sponsored by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, I think a 57-member group that is mostly Muslim majority countries, a few exceptions, to restrict discussion of religion. And this is taken up by has been taken up by the United Nations and turned into United Nations resolutions. The Islamic bloc is a very substantial one. It's more than 1/4 of the entire UN membership, and there's no bloc that's that large, and they get their way often. So the United Nations, I think I'd agree with you, is in effect heavily influenced by the Muslim states. The focus on Israel is one example of that. This attempt to restrict the free speech about religion is another. It is a problem, yes. The United Nations works via blocs. I am no particular admirer of the United Nations. I wish my government would pull out from it.
My question relates to Libya. I note your fears about what might eventuate once Gaddafi is gone. Should the West then really have intervened? Should we have been more circumspect?
Back in March, there was a fear that the 600,000 or so inhabitants of Benghazi could come under assault from Gaddafi's forces, and there could be massacres. And I think it was legitimate to be worried about this and to try and take steps to prevent such a massacre. And I endorse that. And that's in fact what the UN resolution was about, was protecting the civilians there. But one thing leads to another in warfare. And over the 5 months, what began as a protection of the civilians turned into an attempt to overthrow Gaddafi. And there have been 7,500 sorties against the Gaddafi regime. And increasingly they have been undertaken in concert with the rebels on the ground. And especially in the last few days, they have very good communications now. The rebels on the ground, the NATO forces in the sky, working together to soften up targets, to make, that's why this miraculous, seemingly miraculous walk into Tripoli, well, it wasn't miraculous. It had all this air power supporting it. This was an extension of the original mandate, the original intention, which I think was a mistake. I do not think we should have been party to getting rid of Gaddafi, however loathsome he is. That wasn't our I taught a course for 2 years at the U.S. Naval War College called Strategy and Policy. It's a very interesting course. We had as our textbook On War by Clausewitz, written in 1832. And in it, Clausewitz, the Prussian strategist, argues that before you go to war, you must decide what your goal is, and you must stick to it. It actually is something applicable to much of life, not just warfare. It sounds pretty simple, no? In fact, as this illustrates, and so many other wars illustrate, virtually every war illustrates, in the excitement and drama and fear of war, the goal, the mission changes, without anyone quite noticing it. And what you began with is not what you end with, and you pay a price for it. And I think that's the case here. Keeping the civilians of Benghazi from being massacred, no problem. Overthrowing the Gaddafi regime, problem.
That may well be a good spot to stop. I mean, we can all go home and watch the news and see what's happened today. I mean, I think if Daniel said he was last here a couple of years ago, perhaps we're going to have to get him back a little bit more frequently because the script keeps changing. But thanks again for joining us, Daniel. You're always full of wisdom that we all wish to absorb, and you've helped us out a lot tonight. So please join me in thanking him. Thank you.